The glass doors slammed behind them. Two young black teenagers stood frozen under the blazing afternoon sun, their reflection trembling in the chrome bikes lined inside the dealership. Security had shoved them out, their laughter replaced by humiliation. Inside, a salesman smirked, wiping invisible dust from a helmet worth more than their shoes. The street buzzed with the sound of roaring engines and silent judgment. But moments later, the quiet hum of an unfamiliar car stopped the world around them. What stepped out was not anger, it was power, dressed in silence. And that silence would make history. If stories like this move you, subscribe to Racism Untold Stories, where hidden truths and untold moments of justice come to light every day. The morning sun stretched across the quiet neighborhood, painting every rooftop in gold and every sidewalk in promise. The Rivers brothers, Marcus and Isaiah, stood by the curb of their small brick home, watching a neighbor's motorcycle glide down the street. The machine roared like freedom, its silver frame glinting in the light. Marcus watched it with a steady gaze, his mind mapping the angles and designs, tracing imaginary lines through the air as if he could rebuild it from memory. Isaiah, standing beside him, grinned wide and said nothing. He did not need to. Both brothers shared the same dream, to one day own motorcycles of their own. Their home was modest, but filled with quiet pride. Inside, the smell of coffee mingled with the sound of their mother humming gospel songs while cleaning the kitchen. Their father, Edward Rivers, was already gone for the morning, off to another meeting in the city. To the world, he was Edward Rivers, billionaire industrialist and founder of one of the nation's largest automotive manufacturing empires. But to Marcus and Isaiah, he was the man who still tucked them in when he could, the man who told them to earn every step, but never forget where you started. Edward had grown up with nothing, one of 6 children in a neighborhood where potential often died before it bloomed. He built his fortune from the ground up, brick by brick, after years of rejection and closed doors. Yet despite his power, he raised his children with humility. He did not want them to inherit arrogance. He wanted them to inherit discipline and respect. That morning, Marcus flipped through his sketchbook, a collection of intricate motorcycle designs drawn with pencil and precision. Some were futuristic, others classic. His dream was to study mechanical engineering and design vehicles that combined art with performance. Isaiah leaned over his shoulder, laughing softly. "One day," he said, pointing to one of the sketches, "we will see this in real life." Their summer had been filled with small jobs, mowing lawns, washing cars, and carrying boxes for local shops. They saved every dollar, every crumpled bill and coin, not for clothes, not for gadgets, but for something greater. Together, they had managed to collect just enough to take a step toward their shared dream, to visit a motorcycle dealership and see the machines they admired up close. The dealership they chose was located at the city's edge, far from their neighborhood. It was the kind of place that looked less like a store and more like a museum. The glass walls gleamed under the sun. The floors were polished to perfection, and the motorcycles inside looked like mechanical art. Each model stood on a platform beneath perfect lighting, surrounded by quiet reverence. When Marcus and Isaiah arrived, their excitement was pure and unguarded. They walked through the parking lot, their reflections dancing across the polished cars. Marcus adjusted his collar and exhaled slowly. "We are just here to look," he said, his tone calm but purposeful. Isaiah nodded eagerly. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop. The cold air of the showroom carried more than just climate control. It carried judgment. The salesmen's smiles faltered as their eyes swept across the boys. Their laughter died mid-conversation. The silence that followed was sharp and uncomfortable. Marcus and Isaiah did not notice it immediately. They were too mesmerized by the beauty of the machines. The motorcycles glimmered under soft lights, their frames catching every ray like jewels. Marcus moved slowly, his fingers hovering just above the smooth surface of a matte black Ducati. He whispered almost reverently, "This one." A voice cut through his awe. "Do not touch that." Marcus froze. The voice belonged to a tall man in a crisp shirt and expensive shoes. His smile was tight, the kind that hides disdain behind politeness. He walked toward them, his eyes darting from their sneakers to their clothes. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided that he would not. Isaiah, ever the optimist, nodded. "We just wanted to look," he said, his voice respectful. "We love these bikes." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Do you now?" He looked over his shoulder and chuckled softly, as if sharing a private joke with no one. "Well, these bikes are not cheap, boys." Marcus felt the sting beneath the words. He forced a polite smile. "We know. We are saving up." "Saving up," the man repeated almost mockingly. "That is admirable, but you might want to start somewhere a little more realistic." Isaiah's smile faded. The air felt heavier now. The brothers exchanged a glance, but Marcus stayed calm. He had been taught that silence could speak louder than anger. He nodded once and stepped back. The man gestured subtly toward the door. "You see, we have very expensive inventory here. Company policy prefers that we keep the space clear for serious buyers." Isaiah's brows furrowed. "We are not causing any trouble," he said softly. The man sighed, clearly impatient. "I am not saying you are. I am just saying this might not be the right place for you." Another salesman nearby chuckled under his breath. The sound was low but cutting. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He could hear his father's voice in his mind. "Never let their ignorance define your worth." Still, he could not shake the heat rising behind his eyes. "Come on," he said to his brother. "Let us go." The salesman nodded approvingly, as if he had accomplished something. He turned to another employee and whispered something that made both of them laugh. As the brothers walked toward the door, a security guard appeared, large and expressionless. He opened the door, but his stare was far from neutral. It was a silent accusation. "Gentlemen," he said flatly, "you can leave now." The word gentleman carried no respect. It was an order dressed in sarcasm. Marcus stepped through first, the sound of the dealership door closing behind him echoing louder than the motorcycles inside. Isaiah followed, his fists clenched by his sides. Outside, the sunlight struck their faces, but it felt cold. They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Isaiah turned back to look at the glass walls. Inside, the salesmen were already laughing again. One of them leaned against a counter, mimicking the way Isaiah had stood near the bikes. They laughed harder. Marcus swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Do not give them the satisfaction," he said quietly. Isaiah nodded, but his eyes burned with humiliation. They walked toward the edge of the parking lot, their reflection disappearing from the glass behind them. They did not notice the car pulling in. It was silent, sleek, and dark. The kind of vehicle that made people step aside without knowing why. The valet rushed to open the door, recognizing power even before he saw the face. When Edward Rivers stepped out, his presence seemed to absorb the air around him. He carried no visible anger, only the calm intensity of a man who had faced the world's prejudice and learned to master it. The dealership doors opened again, every head turned, and in that moment, fate began to shift. Inside, the salesmen straightened, their forced smiles returning. They knew who he was. They had seen his face in magazines, heard his name in boardrooms, but none of them realized that the man they were about to greet was the father of the two boys they had just humiliated. Outside, Marcus and Isaiah had stopped walking. They turned as the dark car gleamed in the sun, their hearts pounding with confusion and hope. The man stepping into the dealership was not only their father, he was the reckoning they never expected. The dealership grew unnaturally quiet as Edward Rivers crossed the threshold. Every motion he made was deliberate, calm, and heavy with meaning. His dark suit contrasted against the sterile white of the showroom floor. The staff, moments ago relaxed and careless, suddenly straightened their postures, sensing a shift they could not yet name. Edward had entered thousands of showrooms in his lifetime. He had been celebrated, photographed, honored. Yet in this room there was something different. He could feel the residue of arrogance hanging in the air. The same quiet contempt he had faced decades ago when he was building his empire from nothing. His gaze drifted across the polished motorcycles, the spotless helmets, and finally toward the salesman whose laughter had died the instant he walked in. The manager approached with a bright, nervous smile. "Mr. Rivers, what an unexpected honor," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "If we had known you were coming, we would have prepared—" Edward raised a hand, silencing him without a word. He did not need preparation. What he needed was honesty. His expression remained unreadable, his dark eyes scanning the room with quiet precision. The salesman who had thrown out Marcus and Isaiah stood near the counter, pale and uneasy. He forced a smile that did not survive past his lips. "Sir, welcome. We are deeply privileged to have you. Are you here to look at the new models? Perhaps the Ducati V4 or the Harley CVO?" Edward looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps," he said softly. "But first, I would like to know how you treat the people who come here to admire them." The man blinked. "I am sorry, sir?" Edward did not respond immediately. He walked to one of the motorcycles, the same matte black Ducati that Marcus had admired earlier. He ran his hand gently along its curved frame. The surface gleamed beneath his touch. "This is a fine machine," he said, his voice low, calm, controlled. "Do you know where its engine comes from?" The salesman hesitated, unsure of the question's intent. "I believe the supplier is—" "Rivers Engineering," Edward finished for him. "My company. I designed the prototypes myself 20 years ago." The words landed heavily. The staff exchanged nervous glances. The salesman's throat tightened. "Ah, yes. Of course. I remember now," he stammered. "Your company's reputation is legendary. We are honored to—" Edward turned to face him fully. His gaze was piercing, unflinching. "Do you honor the people who build the engines that make you rich? Do you honor the families behind the machines? Or only the ones who walk in wearing suits and polished shoes?" The question hung in the air, thick and electric. The salesman shifted, his smile faltering. "Sir, if there has been any misunderstanding—" "There has not," Edward interrupted. His tone remained calm, but it carried the weight of authority. He looked toward the entrance, where the glass doors began to part once more. Marcus and Isaiah stepped inside. Their movements were slow, uncertain. The same security guard who had thrown them out stood near the door, now suddenly still, his expression drained of confidence. The brothers looked around the room, realizing too late what was happening. Every eye turned toward them. The atmosphere grew heavy. Edward gestured for them to come closer. "These," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "are my sons." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. The salesman swallowed hard, his face turning red. "Sir, I did not realize—" Edward's voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "That they were human?" No one moved. Edward stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "You looked at them and saw their skin, not their character. You assumed they could not belong here. You saw what centuries of bias taught you to see. Not reality, but a shadow of your own prejudice." The manager began to stutter an apology, his words tumbling over each other. "Mr. Rivers, please, we have always respected our customers. This was an unfortunate mistake, an oversight." Edward turned to him sharply. "A mistake is when you drop a glass. What happened here was a decision. You decided that two young black men could not afford your machines. You decided that they did not belong. He turned to his sons, his expression softening slightly. Marcus stood tall beside him, his jaw tight, but his eyes filled with silent pride. Isaiah, still fighting the sting of earlier humiliation, looked at the ground. Edward placed a hand on his shoulder. "Lift your head, son," he said quietly. "Never bow to ignorance." Then he faced the room once more. "When I was their age," he continued, "I was told I would never make it. I was told people like me could never own a company, could never stand in rooms like this. And yet, here we are. The same prejudice that once tried to silence me now hides behind polite smiles." The customers who had been pretending not to watch began to step back, uncomfortable. Some looked guilty, others simply curious. The dealership staff stood frozen, every trace of arrogance stripped away. Edward took a slow breath. "You see, gentlemen, the problem with racism is that it hides best in professionalism. It wears suits, it shakes hands, and it smiles while it excludes. You thought you were protecting your brand. Instead, you exposed your ignorance." The salesman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was pale now, his arrogance replaced by fear. The security guard looked down at his shoes. Edward turned slightly toward the showroom window. Outside, his car gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of the very success that prejudice had tried to deny him. He gestured toward it. "Everything I have built," he said, "came from being told no. Every rejection, every insult, every locked door became fuel. I built an empire from the ashes of discrimination, and I will never allow anyone to treat my children as less than who they are." His words struck the room like thunder. The tension became almost unbearable. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Then, without raising his voice, Edward said, "I will be speaking with your corporate partners. I will ensure they understand the culture you allow here." The manager's face drained of color. He stepped forward quickly, his tone desperate. "Please, Mr. Rivers, we can resolve this quietly. We value your partnership." Edward's gaze hardened. "You value profit. I value respect." He paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle like dust after an explosion. Then he turned back to his sons. "Marcus, Isaiah, remember this moment. Success without dignity is failure in disguise. The way they treated you is not your burden. It is their shame." Marcus nodded slowly. Isaiah lifted his head. The anger that had burned in him earlier was replaced by something deeper. Clarity. Edward turned once more to the staff. "You wanted to teach my sons that they did not belong here. Instead, you have reminded the world why change is still necessary." He stepped forward, his shoes silent on the polished floor. "I built engines that move nations, but today, I hope to build something greater. Awareness." The words lingered long after he finished speaking. When he walked out of the dealership, the crowd outside had already begun to gather. Someone had recorded part of the scene through the window. The video would soon travel farther than any of them could imagine. But at that moment, none of them cared. For Marcus and Isaiah, walking beside their father felt like walking in the light after years of shadows. The dealership behind them stood still, its silence heavier than before. Every employee inside knew something irreversible had happened. The laughter that once filled that room would never return. And as the Rivers family stepped into the sunlight, the world, or at least one small part of it, began to change. The silence inside the dealership became a storm waiting to break. Edward Rivers stood in the center of the showroom, surrounded by shining motorcycles and trembling egos. Every eye was fixed on him, but his gaze never wavered. His composure was sharper than anger, stronger than rage. He did not need to shout. His presence alone carried the force of authority earned through decades of struggle and triumph. He turned slowly, letting his eyes rest on each man who had laughed, each face that had smirked, each mouth that had spoken cruelty disguised as professionalism. The weight of his silence was unbearable. The staff looked down, ashamed to meet his gaze. Customers whispered among themselves, their curiosity shifting into discomfort as realization dawned. Edward finally spoke, his tone calm and deliberate. "In this room," he said, "I see machines that represent power, freedom, and prestige. Yet the people who sell them do not understand any of those things. True power is not measured by the price of a machine, but by how you treat the people who stand before you." The manager, pale and sweating, stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. Rivers," he began, his voice shaking, "please understand that what happened earlier was an isolated incident. It does not represent our values." Edward cut him off, his voice steady but sharp. "Do not hide behind corporate language. I built my life dismantling men who said the same thing. You can tell yourself it was a mistake, but your eyes told a different story. Your laughter told a different story. My sons walked in with respect and walked out humiliated because you could not see beyond your prejudice." The manager opened his mouth again, but Edward raised a hand. "Enough," he said quietly, and the single word silenced the room completely. He turned to his sons. Marcus stood tall, his shoulders squared though his hands trembled slightly. Isaiah stared at the ground, his jaw tight, remembering the sting of the security guard's hand on his shoulder. Edward looked at them both. "Look at me," he said softly. When they lifted their eyes, they saw not just a father, but a man who had carried the same wounds once, and had turned them into weapons of resilience. He nodded to them. "Today, you learn that the world will try to remind you of your place, but it cannot define it. Only you can do that." He faced the staff again. "When I began my company, I was rejected from nearly every dealership in this state. I was told I did not belong in the automotive world. I was told I would fail. I built engines in a rented warehouse with second-hand tools. I hired men and women who were ignored because of their color. And now, those engines are the ones you profit from. Those engines sit in every single motorcycle on this floor." Gasps echoed through the room. The salesman who had mocked the boys turned white as chalk. His arrogance dissolved into fear. "Mr. Rivers, please," he stammered. I had no idea they were your sons." Edward's eyes flashed. "That is the problem," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "You should not have needed to know. Their worth did not change because of their last name. It was your perception that was flawed, not their presence." He took a step forward. "I have spent my life fighting for the idea that success should belong to anyone willing to work for it. But what good is progress if ignorance continues to hide in plain sight? You do not get to humiliate my sons and then call it a misunderstanding." The salesman's eyes darted to the manager for help, but the manager looked just as defeated. The room had shifted completely, from arrogance to accountability. Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. His assistant, waiting outside, answered immediately. "Yes, Mr. Rivers?" "Send in the documents," he said calmly. Moments later, the dealership doors opened again, and a sharply dressed woman walked in carrying a leather folder. Every head turned as she handed the documents to Edward. He opened them slowly, then looked at the staff. "These papers," he said, "terminate all future contracts between Rivers Engineering and this dealership chain. Effective immediately, you will no longer receive our engines or any technical support. I will personally ensure that your corporate partners understand why." The manager stepped forward, panic spreading across his face. "Mr. Rivers, please reconsider," he pleaded. "This could ruin us. We employ dozens of people. We cannot afford—" Edward's gaze hardened. "You could afford to humiliate two innocent young men. Now you can afford the consequences." The room filled with uneasy murmurs. The staff looked at one another, realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. The dealership's success depended on Rivers' engineering. Without those engines, their future was uncertain. Edward handed the folder back to his assistant. "You teach the world how to treat you," he said, "and today I have taught you." He turned toward the showroom floor, the reflection of his sons visible in the polished chrome around him. "To every person here who watched this happen and said nothing," he continued, "remember that silence is not innocence. It is agreement. The world changes only when good people refuse to stay quiet." The salesman lowered his head. The security guard stood motionless, shame tightening his jaw. The customers began whispering again, some recording discreetly on their phones. The story was already spreading beyond these walls, carried by the eyes of witnesses. Edward placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Do you remember when you asked me what strength means?" he said softly. Marcus nodded. "This is what it means," Edward continued, "to stand in truth, even when it is uncomfortable, to demand respect without raising your voice, to let dignity be your loudest weapon." He looked at Isaiah. "You wanted to see the world," he said gently. "Now you have. But never forget, the world must see you too. And when it does not, make it." Isaiah blinked back tears and nodded slowly. The humiliation that had burned inside him began to transform into something else. Pride, tempered by purpose. Edward turned one final time toward the staff. "My sons will buy their motorcycles elsewhere," he said. "But remember this moment, because the price of prejudice will always be higher than the price of respect." With that, he began to walk toward the door. Each step echoed through the silent showroom like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. Marcus and Isaiah followed behind him, their heads high. The glass doors opened, and the blinding sunlight poured in as if to cleanse the air of everything that had just been revealed. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Some had heard the raised voices, others simply recognized Edward Rivers. Cameras clicked, phones recorded, and whispers turned into stories. As he reached the car, Edward paused and looked back at the dealership one last time. Behind the glass, the salesman stood frozen, his face a mask of regret. The manager was already on his phone, his posture crumbling. The staff stared at the floor, afraid to meet each other's eyes. Edward spoke quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for his sons to hear. "For every door that closes, another must open. But sometimes you have to build it yourself." He stepped into the car, and the engine started with a deep, steady growl, the sound of his own creation, his own legacy. As the car pulled away, Marcus looked through the window at the dealership shrinking behind them. It was no longer a place of humiliation. It had become a symbol of truth, of justice, of the cost of arrogance. And though Edward Rivers had not raised his voice once, he had shaken the walls of prejudice more than any shout ever could. The following morning, the sun rose with quiet determination, casting long golden streaks across the city skyline. In Edward Rivers' world, dawn had never felt quite like this before. The air seemed charged with the remnants of the previous day's storm, heavy with consequence, yet clean with truth. Across social media, the story had already taken flight. Videos from bystanders spread like wildfire. CEO shuts down racist dealership. Edward Rivers teaches a powerful lesson on respect. And sons of black business icon humiliated, then vindicated. Hashtags filled the timelines. News outlets requested statements. Comment sections flooded with debates about accountability, corporate prejudice, and the quiet strength of Edward's actions. But inside the Rivers household, things were different. The world outside roared with noise, but within those walls, peace had taken a seat. The family gathered in the kitchen that morning, their breakfast untouched for a long time. The silence that lingered was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, reflective, alive with meaning. Marcus finally broke it. "Dad," he said quietly, "I did not know you were going to do that. The way you stood there, calm but unstoppable. It felt like watching history. Edward smiled faintly. Son, history is not something you wait to witness. It is something you make. Yesterday I did not act out of anger. I acted out of necessity. There comes a time when silence becomes complicity. You both needed to see what standing your ground looks like. Isaiah's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. I felt so small when that man grabbed me, he admitted. I wanted to fight back, but something in me froze. When you walked in, I felt the air change. It was like the world stopped to listen. Edward looked at his younger son with warmth. That feeling is what dignity feels like, Isaiah. It does not come from others. It comes from knowing who you are when they forget. His wife, Clara, had been quiet the whole time, her eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. You have taught them more in one day than any school could teach in a year, she said softly. But it should not have to be this way. How many more times must men like you fight the same battle in different rooms? Edward reached across the table and took her hand. Until no one has to anymore, he said. Until respect is not something demanded, but something instinctively given. The rest of the day unfolded like ripples spreading across still water. Calls poured into Rivers Engineering headquarters, some apologetic, others opportunistic. Corporate representatives from the dealership's parent company reached out, desperate to repair the damage. They offered public apologies, donations to diversity initiatives, and promises of internal training programs. Edward listened to them all but agreed to none. Do not send me statements, he told them. Send me actions. Hire people who will change your culture, not decorate it. Meanwhile, his sons became reluctant public figures overnight. Reporters followed them, eager for interviews. Marcus declined most, but Isaiah agreed to one, a local news segment that would soon go viral. Standing before the camera, Isaiah spoke with a steadiness that surprised even him. What happened to us was painful, but it taught me something, he said. Racism is not always loud. Sometimes it hides behind smiles, behind laughter, behind the word mistake. But what my father showed me is that you do not need to fight hatred with hatred. You fight it by standing firm in truth. You fight it by being seen. His words resonated across millions of screens. Teachers shared the clip with students. Churches played it during Sunday services. Activists quoted it in forums. It became more than a personal story. It became a mirror for society. Weeks later, the dealership officially closed. The corporate board had voted to dissolve the branch entirely, unable to recover from the financial and reputational blow. The manager resigned quietly. The salesman who had mocked the brothers issued a public apology online, admitting his wrongdoing. But Edward did not respond. He believed in accountability, not humiliation. Silence this time was his judgment. Instead, Edward focused on building something new. He announced a scholarship program through Rivers Engineering, designed for young mechanics and engineers from underrepresented backgrounds. He named it the Marcus and Isaiah Initiative, honoring the moment his sons had endured and transformed. The scholarships aimed to give young people opportunities to build futures free from the limits that prejudice often imposes. Within months, applications poured in from across the country, letters filled with stories of hope, struggle, and resilience. Each one reminded Edward why he had chosen to confront injustice not just with words, but with vision. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Edward received a letter from a young woman named Tiana from Atlanta. She wrote, "Your story made me believe that I could be more than what people see. I was always told that engineering was not for girls like me, but now I am applying for your scholarship. Thank you for reminding me that my worth is not defined by anyone else's disbelief." Edward read the letter aloud, his voice thick with emotion. When he finished, he looked at his sons. "This," he said quietly, "is the real victory. Not the headlines, not the attention. It is the change that continues when no one is watching." Marcus nodded. You taught them through what you lived, he said, and now we have to carry that forward. Edward smiled, pride glowing in his eyes. That is the only way progress survives, he said, when each generation builds on the courage of the last. Months passed, and the noise of the story faded from public memory, as all viral tales eventually do. But for the Rivers family, the impact remained eternal. Their bond had deepened, strengthened by shared pain and shared pride. Sometimes, Edward still drove past the empty dealership. The lights were off, the sign taken down, the windows covered in dust. To him, it stood not as a symbol of vengeance, but as a monument of transformation, proof that even institutions could crumble under the weight of truth. One afternoon, as he stopped at a red light near the old building, he noticed a group of teenagers standing by the lot, taking photos beside the faded walls. One of them held up a hand-lettered sign that read, "Respect is the new engine." Edward smiled faintly and whispered, "Yes, let it be." As he drove away, the sun dipped low on the horizon, turning the city gold once more. His car engine hummed, a deep, confident sound that reminded him of every fight he had ever won with integrity instead of fury. In his rearview mirror, the old dealership grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, replaced by the open road ahead. That night, he sat on the porch with Clara, the stars glittering above them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You have changed more than a business," she said softly. "You have changed hearts." Edward looked up at the sky. "That is all I ever wanted," he murmured. "A world where our children do not have to explain their worth. A world where respect does not depend on recognition." And in that quiet, infinite night, he felt something shift, not in the world around him, but within it. Because every act of truth, every stand against injustice, every refusal to bow before prejudice created a ripple. And those ripples, once released, never truly ended. They traveled forward, unseen yet unstoppable, carrying with them the legacy of those who dared to demand better. Edward Rivers had built engines all his life, but on that day he had built something greater, momentum for a more just tomorrow. If this story moved you, share it. Let it be seen, let it be felt. Because silence allows prejudice to live, but truth, spoken and shared, can end it. This is Racism, Untold Stories. Subscribe to the channel, and together, let us uncover the truths that still need to be told. One story at a time.